thank you. Yourself?
Yes, I'm good. I'm good. Yeah.
Good.
Okay, brilliant. So Orlando, this year the theme of the conference is about stories and identities and values and our behaviors. And I know that I've seen you speak before and know that you like to tell good stories, but tell me about when you were being educated as a youngster back in Jamaica. What kind of stories influenced you? What stories kind of shaped your identity when you were growing up?
Growing up in Jamaica, there were stories all around. And sometimes stories were structured. And sometimes, obviously, it was a passive event in the sense that you were consuming stories, but you weren't conscious that there were stories. So stories was always happening.
I remember you told me the story about the Queen of Jamaica. Now, is that a story that you were taught in school, or is that a story that was just passed down informally?
It has been taught in school, but it was, I become aware of the importance of the story, because sometimes stories can go over your head without being aware that something was being said that, you know, of historical importance or whatever. It's just stories. A lot of stories start with once upon a time, and when you hear those phrases once upon a time, you tend to think, oh, here we go. So, and sometimes it's quite important. Queen Annie, I became aware of Queen Annie in secondary school. I had a teacher, one of my favorite teachers, Mr. Price. I never forget his name. He was a consummate communicator. It was a bit like yourself, if I might say so. And he knew how to teach, how to give facts and then add a story about the facts as a sort of conjunction about in putting over the narrative. And Mr. Price was a geography teacher.
Oh, I see. Because I was going to ask you, was he a history teacher? That's so interesting that I naturally assumed if he told you the story about Queen Annie, I thought he would be a history teacher, but in fact, he was a geography teacher.
Well, he was a geography teacher. And when he taught us about how the island actually evolved out of the sea hundreds of years ago from an eruption, and the stones and the quality of the soil and so on, he was telling us about. And he told us about the mountains in Jamaica was limestone. And he said many years ago, a group of people lived in the mountains, and they fought the British. And he told a story about Queen Annie, had nothing at all to do with the geology of the island, but that made me sit up and take notice. Not so much about the geology of the island, but about Queen Annie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that made the story relevant to you. You know, maybe it didn't make any difference to your life whether the mountains consisted of limestone or, you know, any other mineral, but the fact that there was this heroine who fought against the British, this dominant power, that made you sit up because it was relevant.
Well, that's right. That's right, because at the same time, I was being schooled by my peers about other aspects of Jamaican society. So when I left school, the formal learning in school, we met in groups and we sit around, we talk about, what was taking place in the island in terms of politics and so on. And I was 14, 15, and these guys were a lot older than me. Some were in their late teens and 20s. And I was just agog, what they were saying. Mm-hmm. So I was able to put all these things together, all these stories.
So growing up with these stories that, that were relevant to you, stories that you saw yourself reflected in some way, it may have shaped your self-esteem, your self-confidence, knowing that you come from a culture where there were these heroes and these heroines that you can relate to. So that can shape our culture. But imagine being brought up in an education system where you don't see yourself reflected in any of the stories, all the stories that are taught, there's no one who looks like you, who seems to be in any shape or way associated with you. What, can you think of what impact that may have on the self-esteem or the self-confidence of someone who goes through 10, 12 years of education and doesn't ever see any stories in which they are ever featured?
In the education system?
In the education system, yeah.
The education system did contain stories that I would regard as being positive. I wouldn't say that there wasn't any. There were stories about George William Gordon, for instance, who was a free man. His mother was a slave. His father was English, and he was a Baptist minister. And he actually agitated against the system and for the abolition. And is the parliament in Jamaica bears his name to this day, George William Gordon. So we learn about stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in Jamaica you do, but in England, for example, we don't. So I never knew about Queen Nanny until you told me about Queen Nanny. I didn't learn about Queen Nanny at school because in the education system that I was brought up in, she wasn't obviously considered to be relevant. So that's what I'm saying. It's like that makes a difference. If you were educated in Birmingham, maybe you may never have heard of Queen Nanny unless somebody in your family or somebody associated with you informally told you about Queen Nanny. You might not have learnt about Queen Nanny at school.
I think with the advent of social media, things like that, people are becoming more aware of their history and stuff. So that's one good thing about social media. It's bring home to people in a positive way what happened in their environment, in their history, but that wasn't taught in formal education in the colonial experience.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so knowing that stories are really relevant, what stories do you keep close to your heart to empower you? What stories do you hold dear that give you strength to face your challenges and to overcome life's obstacles?
That's a very interesting question. There are many stories that is relevant to me now, and that really touches me in a positive way. But there's a quote, other than a story, that I came across much by accident. And apparently this quote was being used by by Barack Obama and Martin Luther King, and indeed Abe Lincoln used this quote. And this quote was written by a guy called Theodore Parker, and he was a Unitarian minister back in the 1850s. And the quote was, the moral code of justice. I'm trying to remember the exact wording. This particular quote was very important to me now because it makes what I've been experiencing so far relevant. And as I said, Barack Obama and Martin Luther King used the quote, the moral arc of justice is long. The moral arc is long, but it bends towards justice. You've heard of this quote. Mm. And I've only became aware of this quote, and I began to think that all the stories, most of the stories that have been learned, that have been taught and over these years are really true and relevant because the moral arc of justice is long. And what is important to me is that there is the cosmic relevance in that quote doesn't mean that you can sit back and wait for justice. You've got to work to bend that curve. And it's what we do with our lives and what we do to influence change that is important, that will actually bend the curve towards justice.
Well, there's also the saying that history is written by the victors. And when we think about, all the different colonializations, the dominations, the cultural hegemony, it's usually the dominant culture which writes its story. So we tend to remember the stories, not the stories that may reflect us necessarily, but the stories that are dominant, that support the dominant narrative. And the stories of those who have been eradicated, I suppose, culturally, like their stories disappear. But then it's amazing how these stories, although we think they were lost, they tend to reappear, resurface as though mysteriously, like even the stories of the Maroons, for example. The Maroons, during their time, those stories were not elevated, whereas later on, maybe centuries later, those stories are told about these people who lived hundreds of years ago, but during their time, they were not famous during their time, but they're famous long after they're gone.
Well, I think this is where social media is also important because it galvanizes, social media is able to galvanize people with any thought of morality, bring them together and in pursuance of justice. And over the last several months, you'll be aware of the movement of Black Lives Matter movement, that after the death of the killing of George Floyd, globally, people begin to talk about the injustices that people were facing, and that helped to galvanize them towards activating for change.
Yes, because people made the connections, so that story triggered the lots of other stories to be articulated, because there were so many hidden stories. And then once one story surfaces, it also brings together like this, you're casting the net, and the net is like all these little stories, or seemingly smaller stories resurfaced, and it became a much bigger story. That story synthesized, it latched onto lots of other stories and became a huge story.
Well, yeah, I understand that, and I accept that, and that's a fact. In the sense of my personal stories, what when my parents left for the United Kingdom, for England, my father left, and then shortly after my mother left. And I was lost, literally lost, because both my parents went, and I was being boarded out with distant relatives who would look after my well-being. I was clothed and I was fed, but I wasn't being nurtured. And I longed for that. I longed for that. In fact, the environment I was brought up in was quite a difficult environment, because the man of the house, he liked to drink. Mm-hmm. And when he did, he became violent and abusive in a very nasty way. And I lived under that from the age of 7, until I came to this country at 16. And it affected my life. And so the stories in that affected the way I thought, and the way I thought I would lead my life, and decisions I would make based on what I experienced. Those little stories that you talk about, I experienced, changed my outlook, or formed rather my outlook on life.
It's very complex, isn't it? Because there are stories that we, stories that form our lived experience. And there are stories, other people's stories, that influence our lived experience. And there are stories that we become a part of, like, as we say, George Floyd is a story that connected with other people's stories. So there are so many different facets to these stories, but inherent in them are the values. What are the top values that you hold dear based on the stories that you have been influenced by and the stories that you have chosen to create for yourself? What are the values? What are the core values?
Bob Marley did a song called Bad Card. Now, bad card to most people outside of the culture would mean nothing. But this song was about life itself. And bad card is about the game of dominoes. You've heard of dominoes. Mm-hmm. But when you drew bad cards to play the game, if you drew 7 doubles, you got double 5, double 6, double, and so you could throw them in, and the players would shuffle again. But in life, when you drew bad cards, whatever your experience was, you had to play that hand. And that stayed with me. that's a story in a song that stays with me. Whatever life throw at you, you've got to play it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's like being given a particular role. If somebody says, this is your role, your role is in this play, you've got to play, I don't know, the cleaner, for example. You've got to play the cleaner the best way that you can. Or somebody might give you the role and say, look, you're the king in this play, and you've got to play the part of the king as well as you can. And in fact, like, they are both roles, and you might be excellent at playing the role of a king. Somebody else may feel that they much prefer to play the role of the cleaner because it's, it feels more comfortable for them. They enjoy that more rather than, playing the role of the king, so it's a question of like, what is the role that has been given to us, and can we change that role? Somebody gives us the role of a king, and can we change it to be something that, to be an artist rather than a king, because being an artist is much more enjoyable than being a king. Can we mold that role to our own, in accordance with our own interests?
Well, that's where the art of creativity comes in,
Mm-hmm.
where you look around and you think to yourself, well, this is what I really want to do, but I'm in this situation. How can I achieve this? And that's when you become creative in thinking about how you're going to change what's been handed to you. And a few years ago, I had to sell my business because of ill health, and then I thought, well, I need to get back active and start a new business. And I started in the process of getting this business together. But then I came onto a roadblock, if you like. And this was finance. The business required finance. The ideas was fine, and I put the website together, and everything was there, but it needed finance. And so I thought to myself, how am I going to finance this thing? And I didn't want to go about in a certain way, like going back to do a cottage industry sort of thing. I thought I'd grown up past that. And so I had to find a way. And in finding a way, I realized that I had to get a clear understanding about how to do business in the modern era. Because my last business was in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And so I went about doing courses. And I also joined Toastmasters to learn how to express myself in the modern era in doing business. So I had to find different ways creatively, and I'm still in the process of finding ways to establish my business in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it's about using the resources that are available to us and being able to collaborate with others who have the resources that we don't have. So we talked earlier about stories becoming part of a bigger story. And I think that a lot of entrepreneurs, when they start out, I know you've been in business for a long time, but there is a tendency to want to do everything independently, whereas when entrepreneurs collaborate with other entrepreneurs, that's usually when the movement, there is an inevitable movement when you've got at least 2 or 3 different people involved in it. And so have you been collaborating with others? Like, have you enabled others to become a part of your story, that the story that you're creating with your enterprise?
Yes, I am conscious of that and I'm aware of that. But there is a feeling in me at the moment about collaborations. And the feeling is I'm having to be very wary about collaborations. I've collaborated in business before, I've collaborated in life. And for some reason, the collaboration didn't turn out in the way I wanted it to. And so I'm at a point where I'm just getting over that wariness about collaborations.
Yes, there's a lot of trust that is required for a collaboration to work. And with trust, sometimes life brings about the emergence of things that are totally unexpected and sometimes unforeseen. Well, most of the time, the emergent features are unforeseen and unwanted because they don't fit in with our initial vision. And so when we collaborate with somebody else, it's like it reshapes our vision. It becomes something which is, you know, a vision that may seem quite alien to us because it's not a vision that we had, but it's a new vision that's formed with this collaboration. Two stories have come together, and two stories have come together in a way that they've recreated a totally different story.
Yes, it's there's always a possibility. I'm very passionate about my story, and I'm guarded, if you like, about changing my story with other people's story. Other people got their story, and I've got my story, and I intend to get my story across. Mm-hmm. Whether I'll be successful at it to the extent that I would like, who's to tell? But I am passionate about my story, mm-hmm. and the way I get my story across. The funny thing about that, I think, Jesvi, is that I've met people who, like you've just said, who wants to share and collaborate. And after doing my due diligence, my spirits just didn't take those persons, and I pull away from that. So, and in the past, I would have just plowed in, hell bent, and see what come of it. But now I'm more cautious. Mm-hmm. And so after doing my investigations, I decided that no, I don't want to work with these people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of creativity and stories, they are mysterious. We don't really know how they're going to turn out. Even if it's our own story that we're shaping, there is a lot of mystery about our own story. You know, very often in my life, I've had goals and I haven't achieved goals, my goals that I set for myself, but I've achieved something which was even better. And that happened mysteriously. You know, like even the fact that I'm here in Birmingham, I didn't plan. This was never my dream, but it's exactly the place where I'm meant to be. And it's like, how did this happen? I didn't plan for this, but it, you know, I obviously keep setting myself goals, but what life brings to fruition in my life, it's something mysteriously wonderful, but not something that I planned.
Well, that's what they say. Happens when you trust your instincts and you go with where life leads you. There's a lot of water that has passed under my bridge, and I haven't got to the point where I can trust to that extent to find out what, if anything, is on the other side. So again, maybe someday I'll be able to get past that guardedness that I've got now, and open up into a new tomorrow. I don't know.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I look forward to being a part of your ongoing journey, Orlando, and we'll have another discussion about your next phase in the journey at some point, hopefully very soon. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Genevieve.
Bye bye, Orlando. Bye bye. See you soon. Bye bye.